The dust tasted of punishment. It coated her tongue, filled her nose, settled in a gritty film over her skin. It was the same color as the flat, bored sky, the same color as the town, the same color as the faces that stared and then turned away. She stood tied to a hitching post, the coarse rope a familiar bite against her wrists. Her feet, bare and split, were pressed into the hot, shifting earth. She had learned to make herself small, to retract into a place deep inside where the jeers of men and the hard, judging eyes of women could not fully reach. She was a stone. A post. A thing left to be claimed or discarded. The sun was a hammer beating down on her head, bleaching the memory of color from the world. Hours bled one into the next, marked only by the shifting angle of the shadows that offered no relief. A dog barked. A child cried. A wagon wheel groaned under a heavy load. These were the sounds of a life that did not include her. The crowd that had gathered earlier, drawn by the raw spectacle of a woman being sold off to settle a gambling debt, had thinned. Their curiosity had been spent. Now only a few loafers remained, leaning against the saloon veranda, their gazes as vacant as the windows of the abandoned mercantile across the street. She did not look at them. She did not look at anything. Her focus was a point in the middle distance, a place where the heat shimmered off the ground and made the horizon tremble. To look at them was to acknowledge them. To acknowledge them was to feel the shame they wanted her to feel. The man who had put her here, Jedediah Vance, had already ridden on, promising to send for his winnings when it was convenient. He had left her like a sack of feed, an object whose value was fixed and whose feelings were irrelevant. Her world had shrunk to the tight circle of her bonds and the unyielding heat of the afternoon. Then a shadow fell over her. It was different from the others, cooler and more complete. She did not flinch, did not look up. She had learned that stillness was a kind of shield. The silence in the town square changed. It was no longer empty but waiting. The loafers on the veranda straightened up. A low murmur passed between them. He stood before her, a man made of dust and leather. His boots were scuffed gray, his coat long and frayed at the cuffs. He was thin as a fence rail, but he stood as if he had roots reaching down into the hardpan earth. He carried whole winters in his eyes, a landscape of loss that she recognized because she carried a similar one inside herself. He was not looking at her with pity or with hunger, the two currencies she had come to expect from men. He was just looking. His gaze was steady, observational, like a man assessing a damaged tool to see if it could be mended. He turned his head slightly, his eyes finding the town's self-appointed constable, who was also the saloon owner. The man swaggered forward, a greasy smile on his face. "She's Vance's property now," the constable said, hooking his thumbs in his belt. "Cost him a fair bit." The stranger said nothing. His hand went into the pocket of his worn trousers and came out with a few coins. They were not many. He walked to the rain barrel beside the saloon steps and placed them on the lid. The clink was small, but it cut through the heavy air. "That settles Vance's whiskey debt." The stranger's voice was low, rough, like it came from under floorboards. It was not a request. The constable squinted, looking from the coins to the man. There was something in the stranger's stillness that gave him pause, a quiet authority that outweighed the meager payment. He shrugged, his greed momentarily eclipsed by a flicker of caution. "Suit yourself, Elias. She's your problem now." Elias. The name hung in the air. He turned back to her. He did not reach for her. He pulled a small, worn pocket knife from his coat. The blade clicked open. With two swift, clean motions, he sliced through the ropes at her wrists. The fibers fell away, leaving raw, red lines on her skin. She kept her arms perfectly still, her hands hovering in the space where they had been bound. She did not rub them. She did not look at him. She waited for the next command. He folded the knife and put it away. He gave a slight nod toward the dusty track that led out of town. "Come on." He started walking, his pace slow and measured, never looking back to see if she followed. For a long moment, she remained by the post, a creature untethered and unsure. The sun beat down. The dust swirled at her feet. Then she took a single hesitant step. Then another. She followed the dark shape of his back as it moved away from the town, leaving the whispers and the stares behind them. She did not know his name, not really. She only knew the cool piece of his shadow. The journey was a long, silent procession. The dust lifted behind them like ghosts of the people they had been. The land was wide and unforgiving, a canvas of baked browns and pale, thirsty greens. The wind was a constant, dry whisper, pulling at her ragged dress and lifting strands of her matted hair. Elias walked ahead, setting a pace that was just slow enough for her blistered feet to manage. He never spoke, never looked back, but she knew he was aware of her every stumbling step. After an hour, when the sun was at its most cruel, he stopped. He unhooked a canteen from his hip and held it out to her, his gaze fixed on the horizon. His gesture was impersonal, functional, yet it was the first act of direct kindness she had received in more time than she could measure. Her hand trembled as she reached for it. The metal was warm from the sun. She drank slowly, the water tasting of tin and life. She drank until her throat no longer felt like sandpaper, then screwed the cap back on and handed it back to him. Their fingers did not touch. He hooked it back onto his belt and they walked on. His homestead was little more than a scar on the vast, empty face of the plains. It was a small, sod-roofed cabin, its wooden walls weathered to the color of bone. A lean-to stable stood nearby, looking as if it were held up by sheer force of will. A fence, in need of mending, enclosed a small patch of struggling corn. The place did not feel like a home. It felt like a waiting room. Beside the cabin, there was a single, stark feature, a mound of earth marked by a simple wooden cross. The wood was silvered with age. There were no flowers, no decorations, just the stark geometry of its shape against the endless sky. He paused there for a moment, his hat in his hands, before continuing to the cabin door. She understood. This was a place haunted by an absence, an emptiness that matched the one inside her. He pushed the door open. It groaned on its leather hinges. The inside was as stark as the outside. It was one room, spare and meticulously clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. A rough-hewn table with 2 chairs stood in the center. A bed, neatly made, was tucked into a corner. There was nothing soft, nothing personal, save for a small, closed trunk at the foot of the bed. The air was cool and smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs. He gestured to a small alcove near the fireplace where a cot and a thin blanket were arranged. "Yours," he said. It was the first word he'd spoken since they left the town. He then walked to a shelf, took down a plate, and placed a piece of dry bread and a strip of jerky on it. He set it on the table. He did not invite her to eat. He simply provided the food, then turned and walked back outside, leaving the door ajar. She stood in the middle of the room, listening to the sound of his footsteps receding. She looked at the open door, at the slice of pale sky beyond. He had not locked her in. The thought was so foreign it took a moment to settle. She walked to the table and touched the bread. It was real. She was in a room with a bed and food and an unlocked door. She did not yet feel safe, but for the first time in a long, long while, she felt the absence of immediate threat. And that, she thought, was a silence she could learn to live in. The days settled into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the needs of the land. It was a life stitched together with raw thread, functional and without adornment. They moved in parallel orbits, rarely intersecting but always aware of the other's presence. A language of silence grew between them, built from shared space and mutual observation. She rose before the sun, the chill of the floorboards a sharp reminder of where she was. She would sweep the packed earth floor, the soft whisk of the broom a quiet sound in the pre-dawn stillness. She learned the landscape of his life through chores. She mended the torn hem of the cabin's single curtain. She scrubbed the soot from the stones of the hearth until they were pale gray. She found a rhythm in the work, a purpose that was small but solid in her hands. He would be outside, his movements economical and sure. He mended the fence with new wire, his hands working the pliers with a practiced efficiency. He tended to his single horse, his voice a low, soothing murmur that she could hear through the open door. He never asked her to help, but when she left a bucket of fresh water near the stable, he used it without comment. One afternoon, while gathering firewood, she found a single, stubborn prairie rose blooming near the creek bed, its color a startling splash of defiant pink against the brown earth. On impulse, she plucked it. As dusk settled, she walked to the lone grave beside the cabin and gently pushed the stem into the dry soil at the base of the wooden cross. It was a small, silent offering to the ghost that lived with them. The next morning, she found a heavy wool shawl draped over the back of her chair. It was old and smelled of cedar, but it was thick and warm. His scent clung to it faintly. She wrapped it around her shoulders. It felt like an answer. They ate their meals at the same table but at different times. He would eat first, leaving her portion on the plate for when he was done and had gone outside. But one evening, a stew she had made from rabbit and wild onions drew him to the table while she was still there. He sat and they ate together in the dim light of a single candle. The only sounds were the scrape of spoons against the wooden bowls and the crackle of the fire. The shared space felt charged, a boundary crossed without a single word. She began to cook for them both, learning the contents of his meager pantry. She baked bread. Her first loaf was a failure, dense and heavy as a river stone. He ate half of it without a change in his expression, his jaw working methodically. She watched his hands, calloused and scarred, as he broke off another piece. The sight of his quiet acceptance was more comforting than any word of praise. A few days later, he tried his hand at it. He worked the dough with an awkward intensity, flour dusting his dark shirt. The resulting loaf was even worse, a blackened, misshapen rock that sat on the cooling rack like an accusation. She looked at it, then at him. A ghost of a smile touched her lips, the first she had felt in an age. "That loaf died in vain," she said. Her voice was thin, reedy from disuse. He looked at the loaf, then at her. The corner of his mouth twitched. For a split second, the winter in his eyes receded. "You didn't complain about mine." "Mine was only wounded," she replied, her voice a little stronger this time. The moment passed, but it left something behind. A small warmth in the quiet room, a single thread of connection woven into the silence. The quiet was shattered by a nightmare. It came as it always did, a flood of rough hands and jeering laughter, the feeling of being trapped, of her voice being stolen from her throat. She cried out, a sharp, strangled sound that tore through the fabric of the night. She woke up tangled in her blanket, her heart hammering against her ribs, the cold sweat on her skin like a second skin of fear. Silence answered her cry. But then she heard it, a soft creak of the floorboards outside her alcove. He was there, standing vigil. He did not speak, did not enter. He was just a presence in the dark, a silent wall against the terrors of the night. She lay there, listening to the sound of her own breathing slow down, anchored by the knowledge that she was not alone. He stood there until the first pale light of dawn crept through the window, and then she heard his soft footsteps move away. That morning, as he sharpened an axe by the woodpile, he did not look at her when he spoke. "You hurt?" he asked, his voice low. She stood in the doorway, the wool shawl clutched around her. She shook her head. He nodded once, his eyes still on the whetstone. The grinding sound filled the space between them. The conversation was over, but everything had been said. Trust was not a thing of words. It was a man standing guard in the dark. It was the answer to a question that had not been asked. It was the slow, patient thawing of a world that had been frozen for a very long time. The peace they had built was as fragile as a web of frost. It could not last. The past had a long memory and a longer reach. It arrived on a Tuesday in the form of a rider silhouetted against the blood-orange smear of the setting sun. He was not a neighbor. Neighbors approached from the east, along the creek path. This rider came from the west, from the direction of the town, a dark omen moving across the plains. Elias saw him first. He was coming in from the corn patch, a hoe balanced on his shoulder. He stopped dead, his body going rigid. He watched the figure grow larger, the steady beat of the horse's hooves a slow, predatory drumbeat on the dry earth. She was at the window, a dish towel in her hand, and she saw the change in him. The quiet ease fell away, replaced by a tense, watchful stillness that she had not seen since the day he'd cut her free. The rider was young, with the arrogant slouch of a man who worked for someone more powerful than himself. He pulled his horse up a dozen yards from the cabin, careful not to come within arm's reach. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Elias," the rider said, his tone insolent. He did not dismount. "Got a message for you. From Mr. Vance." Elias said nothing. He simply waited, his face an unreadable mask of weathered stone. His stillness seemed to unnerve the boy, who shifted in his saddle. "He's coming for his property," the rider said, finally getting to the point. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He tossed it onto the ground between them. "He'll be here by week's end. Expects her to be ready." The word hung in the air, sharp and ugly. Property. It was a brand, a chain. It undid all the quiet days, all the shared silences. She felt a cold dread seep into her bones, the familiar paralysis of the past reaching for her. She saw herself back by that hitching post, the dust and the shame her only companions. Elias's gaze did not waver from the rider. He did not look at the paper lying in the dirt. His voice, when he finally spoke, was dangerously calm. "Get off my land." The rider smirked, a flash of bravado. Just the messenger, he wheeled his horse around, kicking up a cloud of dust, and galloped back the way he had come, a fleeting shadow swallowed by the encroaching dusk. They stood there until the sound of the hooves faded completely, leaving a ringing silence behind. The world felt smaller, the vast sky suddenly a closing lid. Elias walked over and picked up the paper. He did not read it. He walked to the fire pit, struck a match, and held the flame to the corner of the note. The paper curled, blackened, and turned to weightless ash that the evening breeze scattered into nothing. He looked at her then, his eyes dark with a grim resolve. He did not offer her false assurances. He did not say it would be all right. He simply met her gaze, and in that look there was a silent promise. The threat was no longer just hers to bear. He had burned the message. He had claimed the coming battle as his own. The days that followed were heavy with waiting. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. The sun rose and set, but time was no longer measured in light and shadow, but in the anxious beat of a heart. They moved through their chores with a deliberate, almost desperate focus, as if the simple act of mending a fence or kneading dough could hold the encroaching world at bay. The silence between them was different now. It was not the comfortable quiet of routine, it was the taut silence of a drawn bowstring. She watched him. He oiled his old shotgun, his movements methodical and grim. He sharpened the blade of his felling axe until it glinted in the firelight. He was not a violent man, she knew this in her bones. He was a man preparing to defend a perimeter, not just of land, but of peace. The peace he had painstakingly built from the ruins of his own grief, and the peace he had offered her. The morning Vance arrived, the sky was a bruised, colorless gray. The wind had turned mean, kicking up dust devils that danced across the plains like angry spirits. 3 riders appeared over the rise, their forms dark against the horizon. They were not hurrying. They rode with the unearned confidence of predators who believed their prey was already trapped. Elias was on the porch, waiting. He held the old axe, not menacingly but with the casual familiarity of a tool. It rested in his grip, an extension of his will. He had put on a clean shirt. It was a small, defiant act of dignity. She stood just inside the doorway, her hands clutching the heavy iron poker from the fireplace. Its weight was cold and solid. Her heart was a frantic bird beating against her ribs, but her feet were planted firm on the floorboards of the house she had learned to call home. She would not hide. She would not be taken from the shadows this time. Jedediah Vance swung down from his horse, his expensive coat a stark black against the muted landscape. He was a big man, florid and accustomed to getting his way. The 2 men with him were hired muscle, their faces blank and brutish. Elias, Vance boomed, his voice oozing a false heartiness. I've come to collect what's mine. Saved you the trouble of bringing her back to town, he smiled, a predator's baring of teeth. He treated Elias like a hired hand, an obstacle to be managed. Elias did not move. His gaze was steady, his body a silent wall. She's not a sack of grain, Vance. She's not yours to collect. Vance's smile faltered. He let out a short, ugly laugh. I paid for her fair and square. You settled a bar tab, nothing more. The bill of sale is in my pocket. She's property by law, he gestured to his men. Go on in and get her. Try not to mark her up. As the 2 men started forward, she stepped out of the shadows of the doorway and onto the porch. She stood beside Elias, the iron poker held tight in her hand. Her face was pale, but her eyes, when they met Vance's, were clear and burned with a cold fire he had never seen before. She was not the cowed, silent thing he had tied to a post. Vance stopped, his mouth falling slightly open in surprise. He looked from her to Elias, a flicker of disbelief in his eyes. Her, he sneered, recovering his bluster. You choose this broken-down sodbuster, this empty piece of land, over me? He looked directly at her, his voice dripping with condescending possession. Don't be a fool, girl. I can give you dresses, a soft bed. All he has is dirt. She took another step forward, so she was standing just in front of Elias. The movement was small, but it was a tectonic shift. It was a choice made visible. She did not raise the poker. She did not scream or cry. She simply looked at Jedediah Vance, and her silence was a verdict. It was an answer more absolute than any word she could have spoken. It stripped him of his power, his narrative. In her gaze, he was not a man of means and authority, he was just a cruel, empty man standing in the dirt. His face flushed a deep, mottled red. The defiance, so quiet and so complete, unnerved him in a way a physical fight never could. It was a language he did not understand. He started, raising a hand as if to strike her. Before he could finish, Elias's hand shot out and clamped around his wrist. His grip was like iron. You will not, Elias said, his voice flat and deadly. You will get on your horse. And you will leave. Just then, over the rise, 2 more figures appeared on a buckboard wagon. It was the circuit preacher and his wife, come out for their monthly visit to the outlying homesteads. They pulled to a stop, their faces etched with concern as they took in the scene. Vance, his face contorted in rage, held fast by a grim-faced Elias and a woman standing beside him, armed and unbowed. The sight of witnesses of the town's moral authority broke Vance's resolve. He was a bully, and bullies thrive in the dark in the absence of accountability. He ripped his arm from Elias's grasp, his bravado crumbling into spite. He spat on the ground near her feet. "Keep the trash," he snarled, his voice thick with humiliation. "She's not worth the trouble." He hauled himself onto his horse and, with a vicious kick to its flanks, galloped away, his men scrambling to follow. They vanished as they had come, dark shapes consumed by the gray, unforgiving land. Elias and she stood there watching them go, the wind whipping her hair across her face. The tension drained out of the air, leaving a vast, trembling quiet in its wake. He slowly lowered the axe, its weight seeming to settle him back into his own skin. He looked at her. Her hand holding the poker was shaking, the adrenaline finally giving way. He reached out and gently, carefully, took the iron bar from her grasp. His callous fingers brushed against hers. It was the first time they had ever truly touched. The contact was a spark in the cold air, a current of shared victory, of shared fear. "I was scared," she whispered, the words barely audible over the wind. He held her gaze, the winter in his eyes melting away to reveal something deep and steady. "I know," he said. And in those two words she heard everything. "You were not alone. I was with you. We are safe now." That evening, the fire in the hearth seemed to burn brighter, warmer. The silence that settled over the small cabin was no longer a thing of emptiness or waiting. It was a shared quiet, rich and deep, woven from the threads of a battle won together. They ate their stew at the table, the flickering light casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The house felt different. It had been defended. It had been claimed. After the meal, as he was banking the fire for the night, he spoke into the quiet. He didn't look at her, his attention seemingly on the glowing embers. "They call you anything?" His voice was low, casual, but the question held the weight of the world. She thought of the string of names she'd been given, none of them her own. Girl. Wench. Property. She shook her head, the movement small in the dim light. No. He was quiet for a long moment, staring into the heart of the fire as if searching for something in the flames. He was a man who weighed his words carefully, for he knew their power. When he finally looked at her, his eyes were clear. "Lena," he said. It was not a command. It was not a label. It was an offering. It hung in the space between them, a word soft and strong. She tasted it on her tongue, a name that felt like it could belong to the woman she was becoming, the woman who had stood on the porch with an iron poker in her hand. "Lena," she repeated, her own voice giving it life. It was an anchor. It was a beginning. In the giving and receiving of that name, something was forged between them, something more binding than any law or contract Vance could have produced. The next day, she woke with the name still echoing in her mind. Lena. She went to the small, closed trunk at the foot of his bed, the one she had never touched. It was his wife's. She knew this without being told. With a quiet reverence, she lifted the lid. Inside were neatly folded linens, a small book of pressed flowers, and the faint, lingering scent of lavender. They were the ghosts of a life that was not hers. Carefully, respectfully, she took each item out and placed it on his bed. She would not erase the woman who had come before her, but she could no longer live in her shadow. When the trunk was empty, she went to her own small cot and gathered her meager possessions, the smooth, gray stone she'd picked up from the creek bed, the single, faded ribbon that was the last remnant of her old life, the prairie rose from the grave, now dried and fragile. She placed them inside the trunk. Then she took the heavy wool shawl he had given her, folded it, and laid it on top. She closed the lid. It was not a replacement. It was an addition. It was a declaration that a new life was now being lived within these walls. When Elias came in from the fields that evening, he saw the folded linens on his bed. He looked at the closed trunk. He looked at her. He understood. He walked over, picked up the linens, and placed them on a high shelf, a place of honor and memory. He did not say a word. He didn't have to. That night, a soft rain began to fall, the first in weeks. It was a gentle, cleansing sound on the sod roof. The dust settled. The land drank deeply. It felt like a benediction. They sat together on the porch, watching the darkness soften under the rain, the scent of wet earth rising around them. He had pulled her chair close to his. The silence was easy, comfortable, a blanket they shared against the cooling air. The house behind them was no longer a hollow waiting place. It was warm. It was breathing. It was full. He reached over, his rough hand covering hers where it rested on the arm of the chair. It was a simple, solid gesture. Promise of a shared future. A quiet statement that here, in this small, forgotten corner of the world, two broken people had found the missing pieces of their souls and built a home. So you see, this story, it ain't just about rescue. It's not about a strong man saving a damsel. That's too easy a tale. And the truth is rarely that simple. This is a story about the quiet courage it takes to claim a life that others have tried to write for you. It's about the profound kindness found not in grand declarations, but in a shared meal, a warm blanket, a silent vigil in the dark. It's about two people scarred by the world in different ways who looked at each other and saw not brokenness but the potential for healing. They didn't fall in love. Love is a thing that happens. What they did was harder. They built it piece by painful piece, out of silence and respect and shared work. They built it like a stone wall, sturdy and meant to last. So here is your naming. Think about the silent acts of bravery that have defined your own life. The times you stood your ground when it was easier to run. The times you offered a piece of your bread to someone hungrier than you. Those are the moments that build a soul. They are the foundation of the home you carry inside you. The world will try to tie you to a post, to give you a price tag, to tell you who you are. But your life is not a debt to be settled. It is a field to be planted. And if you're brave enough to tend it, if you're quiet enough to listen, you might just find that you're not out there alone. You might find another soul willing to stand with you, to face down the vancess of the world, and to watch the rain fall with you in the peaceful dark. The fire only changes everything if something new is waiting in the ash.